What's going on, everybody? My name is Jordan. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and the first official golf major of the year is finally here. The Masters starts this week, and I wanted to record a quick video for you guys walking through my process of what I'm going to be doing to build my lineups for this week's event. Now, at the start of the 2023 season for golf, I released a similar video just walking through my general golf process that I use every single week. This video is going to have a lot in common with that because it's my process here both times, but wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that I'm doing for this particular event and just show it in practice how I'm actually using this process each week. I've got a lot to get into here, so let's go ahead and just dive in. Now, right off the bat, as I mentioned in that last video, my process does not generally involve a lot of in-depth research or looking into individual golfers or course fit or course history or things like that. Our model is incredibly robust for golf. We've actually overhauled it for the start of this season, and I'm generally going to take the standpoint of trusting the sims in most of these spots. Again, that sim does take into account the Vegas odds, individual golfer skill, course fit, course history, all of those important factors, so that's not going to be a big focus for me. Instead, a few things I'm going to look into is higher than normal variance situations, which I think this week does bring a little bit for us, as well as focusing on how I'm going to handle game theory and ownership and diversification in my lineups here. So let's go ahead and just dive right in. And again, because I'm not spending a bunch of time up front researching these guys here, I'm going to just get started with a build right off the bat. I'm going to be building for this particular event for the Minimax, for the 150 max, 50 cent Minimax. It is a major this week, so this contest is very large, but that's going to be the contest I'm focusing on here. I'm going to use the default settings for that build. If you're on the SaberSim Pro plan, highly recommend using your 5,000 lineups. I think in golf in particular, it can be very useful to have a bunch of extra lineups in your pool, but we'll go ahead and roll with the 500 default lineups we have for this build and get things started. So we've got our build kicked off here. We've got a pool of 500 lineups and a lineup set of 150 to work with. And the first thing I want to call out is the Saber score, the sorting method that's used for these lineups. I've really been liking the new Saber scores as it relates to golf contests in particular. Our team did a lot of work on these new Saber scores that take into account the player ownership, lineup upside, and the projection of a lineup here. We've actually recently backtested these for golf specifically, and I really like the way that it handles ownership and overall lineup quality here combined. So I'm going to use that Saber score, and that's going to give me a lot of value with my game theory approach, my exploitative approach for this particular slate. Now, as it relates to my particular adjustments that I'm making on this particular slate here, I think there's a couple situations to be aware of. One, I always want to check the weather. And I mentioned in the last video I did at the start of the season that I really like Kevin Roth's weather dashboard here. And this is an interesting one here because we're going to have some rain. We're likely going to have some wind, but a lot of that is going to come in starting on Friday, and it looks like Saturday is the worst overall day. My general rule of thumb with weather in Golf DFS is that if you have a weather forecast that's going to impact projections, it's going to impact performance on the first day of the event, so in this case Thursday, I typically like to take that into account and consider making some adjustments, but we don't really have that here. We do have some rain chances increasing Friday afternoon. There are winds, but it's really hard to accurately project some of this weather here more than 24 hours out here, so I'm not going to make any adjustments right now. With that said, this is something that I'm going to keep a really close eye on as the lock approaches. And if it starts to seem like we're getting a more consistent weather report or some more confidence about when this weather is going to come in, I might start making some adjustments. It does look like the rain and winds are going to get worse in the Friday afternoon. So in particular, I might be looking at some golfers that have the early split on Thursday here and considering to make a few adjustments to projections here using the tee times. I think the easiest thing to do here would be to figure out who's teeing off in the morning and consider maybe making just some light adjustments here to potentially capture that in my build. But I don't want to go too crazy here. And again, it's Tuesday afternoon when I'm recording this. It doesn't even look like we're going to have weather on Thursday here. So even if I'm putting lineups in Wednesday night, I'm still trying to project weather 2 days out, which gets a little tough. But it's something I am going to keep a close eye on. And then that brings me to the second interesting situation we have with this particular event, and that's the LIV Golf guys. For this year's Masters, interesting situation where a lot of these LIV guys are coming back and participating in this event. They've been playing less frequent events in LIV Golf here and generally on easier courses, a little bit harder to assess where the form of these golfers are. The way I'm actually going to approach this is rather than trying to take individual stands and assess whether or not these guys are underpriced or overpriced or under or over-owned, what I'm going to do is basically just assume that this is a higher than normal variance situation. And I talk about this a lot in a lot of my videos here, where I think the best way that you can apply your research, or some of the best spots you can pick to apply your research, is in situations that have naturally higher than normal variance, where the ranges of outcomes of players is wider, or maybe figuring out exactly where that mean is and what that range of outcomes looks like is more difficult than usual. And what I'm going to try to do there is just take a game theory angle. I'm going to say that golfers that are chalkier than average, or look pretty chalky for the slate, the field, for those LIV golfers in particular, the field is probably overestimating the confidence that they have in those golfers given the variance of the situation, and there might actually be some opportunities to get onto some lower owned LIV golfers where the field is undervaluing the range of outcomes of these guys. So rather than assuming that all, as a blanket rule, all the LIV guys are underpriced or all the LIV guys are overpriced or overowned, I'm going to basically embrace variance there and hope that I can be on the right side of a couple game theory flips there between these guys. So let's go ahead and start looking at this here as it relates to my particular build. And I think the easiest thing to do is just to go through and look at leverage and see if I'm getting over or under the field on any of these guys. So Dustin Johnson immediately jumps out here, projected pretty well. Doesn't look like he's going to be too high owned. I actually like that here as one of my bigger stands on the slate. But a guy that is really getting my attention right off the bat here is Brooks Koepka. I always have hated the narrative that Brooks is dominant in majors. I think that's at the very best, a very small sample size for that, and just something that I'm not really willing to buy into, especially with how much it tends to overinflate his ownership. I actually don't like that with how high projected owned we're projecting him to be. I think he could actually even come in higher than this. This is a positive leverage stand for me. I think this is one of my favorite fades on the slate here. Again, just based on the fact that these are higher than variance situations, there's a narrative that I think is going to bring up his ownership. Only showing up in 14% of the lineups in my pool here, and I want to get under the field on this guy, so I'm going to make sure that I am getting at max about 10% on Brooks here. Another name that I wanted to go specifically look for was Cam Smith. He's a guy as well, very talented golfer here, that it just seems like isn't popping very much here in either the projection or the ownership. Just another name here that I think I'm going to embrace the variance on the other side, showing up as optimal here in 11% of our sims. So I want to make sure that I'm getting some good positive leverage over the field. Another situation again where I'm just going to embrace the variance here. I'm going to go through my player pool and look for a couple other names that jump out to me. This isn't something that I'm going to do for every single golfer, but in this particular week's event, this is, I think, one of the big narratives at play that I particularly want to take a stand on. Okay, so I've gone through, I've done a little bit of additional research here and looking into a few of these guys. Let's talk about some of the other changes I've made here. The main thing I've been going through, again, is looking particularly at these LIV golfers here, and then just comparing if I think that the field is overvaluing these players or undervaluing them in this higher than normal variance situation. So the main things I'm using here is the ownership projection and then the pool percentage, which I think is a decent proxy for how likely that player is to be in the winning lineup. For players that I've gotten a sense here that maybe they are a little bit over-owned, I'm capping my exposure here. So again, that's Brooks, Reed, and Mito Pereira, guys that, you know, are not, maybe apart from Brooks, the chalkiest golfers in the field here, but just looking to do something a little bit different and get off of some of these guys here. On the flip side, I have set minimum exposures to a couple of these guys that, again, I think the field is going to underappreciate. I mentioned Cam Smith already, but Neiman, and Bryson all jumped out to me as well. Guys that look like they're going to be very, very low owned, especially comparing some of the other popular golfers in this price range here. And all guys that are popping pretty decent in the pool. I think these guys have a very viable shot at ending up in the winning lineup. Seems like an opportunity to really take an aggressive approach here and make sure I'm getting some exposure to these guys. And again, I think one of the main advantages of taking this approach is that I'm not inputting this bias directly into the sim. I'm not making adjustments to player projections based on this somewhat intuitive sense I have of who's going to be over or under owned. I'm simply building the optimal lineups according to the SaberSim simulation, getting 500 of them, and then selecting my 150 based on player exposures that I think allow me to exploit this particular narrative this week. So last thing I want to do here is just see if I'm particularly over or under the field on any other golfers here. So I'm going to use the leverage column and take a look at this and just get an idea of where some of my stands are here and make sure that I'm not taking a stand that I don't totally expect. One that does stand out to me is Tiger Woods. Obviously, interesting situation, rich history at Augusta here, but still the lagging injury issues here and just a dangerous situation to be in. I don't hate the idea of making that one of your bigger leverage spots. I also think on name value alone, this ownership is likely to be a little bit higher in a week where more casual money's coming in. I could see somewhere to 5, 6, or 7%, and I think a lot of this leverage that I'm getting here is because of a very aggressive ownership fade in the Sabre score. So I'm going to bring this down a little bit closer to what I think is the optimal rate or the percent chance of being in the winning lineup for Tiger, just because I think it's a risk that I don't necessarily need to take, and the reason I'm probably getting a lot of exposure there is because of that ownership projection being a little bit low. Otherwise, again, I just want to make sure that any stands that I'm taking here are somewhat intentional or that I'm aware of the highest leverage positions in my board here. So again, some of these LIV guys that I do like jumping up to the top here, not really opposed to some of the high exposure I'm getting to any of these other guys, so I feel pretty good about that. We'll take a look at some of my biggest fades on the slate here. In golf, I generally don't look for a lot of reasons to get back onto chalky golfers. If SaberSim is telling me that fading a 25% owned 7-6 Corey Connors is the right move, I'm pretty comfortable with doing that here. One that does jump out to me here is Scotty Scheffler, a guy obviously that has been golfing very well recently. I always end up trying to get some exposure to Scotty here, especially in these big events. I'm curious what my top end looks like here and where some of my exposure is. So I think some of that is that I've gotten a little bit of extra exposure to Cam Smith, who's at that kind of similar price range. I'm about equal to the field on all of these top golfers here, and I feel kind of good about that. I think I maybe want to go get a little bit of extra exposure to Scotty here and just make sure that I'm getting kind of close to the field here. I don't know if I agree that Rory is just a far and away best pick at this 10K range here. I think these three guys are a little bit closer, so I'm going to make sure that I'm just getting a little bit closer to the field on these particular golfers. So let's get a little bit more Rory exposure there as well. So that was a lot. Let's go down a little bit there as well. Bring that down. Okay. Maybe we don't need to set this at all. Cool. Let's take one more look here and just make sure that we're happy with our stands overall. So that does bring everything a little bit closer together. Feeling good about that. So the last step I want to do is diversification. Diversify my lineups. You can see here at my highest owned golfer is Rory at 31% or so. I'm not very condensed with my exposures anyway, which is the way I want to be. One thing I do want to do here though is just bump up this min uniques to 2. This is kind of just a me thing. I don't really like the idea of playing lineups that are 1v1s of each other in golf, even with just the 6-player lineups. It does mean that you could end up in a situation where you lose because you eliminated a lineup that was just one player different than a lineup you already had, and maybe you had that second lineup in your pool as well. But there are a lot of different lineups we can play in golf here. There are a lot of different combinations we can make. So I just want to know that I'm playing at least a 2v2 for every lineup that I'm investing into here. The last thing I want to do is we've kind of had a hands-on approach with our overall exposures to different golfers here in this build, but I want to take a more macro approach now and just make sure that I'm not playing any lineups that are very likely to be duplicated from one or duplicated with other lineups in the pool or lineups that are extremely highly owned. This is a week where the Minimax is 190,000 other lineups, so I just want to make sure, even though I am taking some intentional stands, that I'm not playing any lineups that I think are going to be very chalky or have a chance of being duplicated. So there's a couple ways to do that. If you're on the DFS standard plan, the way I like to do this is to get a sense of what the cash lineup looks like for that particular week. We don't need to build too many lineups here to build this here. We'll just build the top 20 optimals and just get a sense of how highly owned are going to be the optimal lineups. And then we'll set a filter on our lineup pool to eliminate some of the lineups that might be very close to that ownership of the cash lineup. If you're on the pro plan, we can get a little bit more specific with using a custom metric for ownership product. So I'll demo that in a second as well here. But it looks like overall the highest owned lineups in the pool are going to be about 131 some ownership. So let's take maybe 90% of that here. And this is just a heuristic that I think works pretty good. Whoops, Google Calculator. So we'll do 131 times 0.9. So I want to make sure my lineups are not really owned more than about 117. And again, this is a very baseline heuristic that I think can eliminate dupes if you don't have ownership product at your disposal here. So what we'll do is ownership less than 117. We'll just call it there. And this will likely eliminate, okay, so in this case, it actually eliminated no lineups from our pool. So no worries there, but it's something I do want to check. I am going to do a check with ownership product as well here, just to make sure that I'm not having any lineups that I think are mathematically likely to be duplicated. I'll put a link in the description for more detail into how ownership product works and what this calculation actually is. But basically what we want to do is we want to do the number of expected dupes divided by the contest size. So in this case, it's 1 divided by about 190,000. That's 19,000, 190,000. And then we're going to take this to the power of 1 over the number of players in the lineup. So for golf, that's 6. So my ownership product here is about 13.1. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I have the custom metric set up. Yeah, ownership, geo mean value. So I'm going to change this here and use geo mean and do less than 13.1. And in this case, it is going to trim off a couple more lineups out of the top here. It's trimming off 49 lineups out of my pool. So there were some lineups here that were not captured in the ownership sum filter that were captured in the geomean filter. So maybe that means to make that ownership sum filter a little more aggressive. But again, all we're doing here is trimming off some lineups that I think are expected to be duped at least one time in the contest, or are likely to be duped at least one time in the contest here. So overall, feeling pretty good. I've gone through, done a little bit of research, applied a stance that I have here on some of these LIV golfers. We've sorted our lineups here, taking into account ownership, and also applied a filter to remove some of the chalkier lineups from our build, and we've diversified a bit with min unique players. All that's left here now is for me to enter these lineups into my contest, which I'm just going to use the entry editor for. I'll click fill entries and go grab my file from DraftKings. And I'll go ahead and get these filled into my contest here. Of course, it is Tuesday afternoon. I definitely want to be paying attention to weather, so I'll probably run this again here with some updated sims and taking a look at the weather one last time here. Probably some updated ownership throughout the week as well. I think I will probably be running my final builds here Wednesday evening, Wednesday night here with all of that up-to-date information. Hope this was a helpful walkthrough of me applying my golf DFS process to the Masters this week. If you have any questions, you can always reach out in our Discord server or at support@sabersim.com. Good luck in your contest this week, and I'll see you next time.